we've looked at so far and heard historically and somewhat abstractly, and using a selection of icons of Mary to sort of see how this all plays out. And depending on how much coffee you've had this morning, I wonder if before we actually look at some of the thinking that was behind Mary's significance, or the significance of the Mother of God in iconography, what sorts of things perhaps you think might have made her such a significant figure for the iconographers? Any ideas? How that percolating in the background? Three particular things were that, in a big picture sort of way, thinking about God becoming human has everything to do with Mary. And so the iconographers would situate Mary in the center of the history of salvation, which in one sense is a very life-giving move to see being made, because it doesn't pigeonhole Mary as simply an instrument or having just a functional use in God becoming human, but Mary is central to that whole coming about. She's not simply passive, because Mary has to say yes when the angel Gabriel comes to her. She has to say yes as you will it. And so much turns on that yes, for God's divine providence to culminate in Jesus becoming flesh, fully divine and fully human. Mary is also significant to how we understand Jesus' own humanity. And what's striking is that in all of the icons we're going to look at, and many of them overall, Mary is always appearing with Jesus. It's that relationship that is so absolutely key to any thinking that the iconographers do about the Mother of God. And so this relationship is the key, where we see not only that Jesus shares the humanity of Mary, his mother, but that Mary also shares the divinity of Jesus, who becomes her son, who is her son. And so, with that sort of broad, fairly theologically hefty scope, we're going to look at three icons particularly today, three types of icons. One is called the icon of the sign, one is called the Hagigatria, and the third one is the icon of loving kindness. And we're going to look at a couple of variations of each of those and look at some of them side by side, so that we can start to see what the differences are in how each icon approaches certain facets, certain expressions, and presentations of both Jesus, Mary, and the context in which they're situated, but also the things that are constant, and the things perhaps that these renderings open up for us of who we believe Jesus to be, and who we believe Mary to be, and what their relationship says about the relationship we are invited into with God. So the first one, this is the icon of the sign, Our Lady of the Sign. And Mary is in what we would call an orans position. It's the same position that priests have when they start the Eucharist. It's a praying position. And this posture of orans, it wasn't exclusively Christian. It was known, and it's talked about in the Old Testament and in the Greco-Roman world. And so we can think of it not simply as a gesture of prayer, but the personification of prayer. In the icon of the sign. You'll remember perhaps from previous weeks we talked about these mandolas, these windows. And what's interesting about this figure is that you'll see that Mary herself appears in a mandola of her own, that pink and red window into heaven that encircles her, just as there is one that encircles Christ. And you'll see that beneath there's a seraph, the angel, and it's worth pointing out, so the reason it's called the icon of the sign is that it's a reference to Isaiah 7:14, which is on your handout. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman, the virgin, is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. So this is the icon of that sign that God gives, of the young woman with child who bears a son and names him God with us. And thinking about how this icon occurs now even, on the iconostasis, which is the stand that has the doors, this is a movable one. The icon of the sign appears in what they call the story, like the stories of a building, the story of the prophets, because it's viewed as the culmination of what Isaiah is prophesying. And so here you can see this is the story, the prophet's story, and that is the icon of the sign. It's in the center there. And I give you a couple of other ones, just to see the different sorts of renderings and context in which this icon occurs. This is another movable one. You see there, Mary, you can see faintly the praying Orion's hands, and Christ in the center. And then this is an icon itself of an iconostasis. And then you see Mary seated with Jesus. And one other thing, I want to go back because it's not simply significant that both Christ and Mary are situated each within their own window into heaven, but also particular note is made of the color of the one in which we see Mary. That the outer rim of it, that's the red and pink, that is a reference to a hymn, the Akathiston, in which Mary is described as the fiery chariot of the word, the brightest morning, bearing the sun, as in the sun that shines in the sky, the sun Christ. And that contrasts with this dark blue of sin and ignorance, which gives way to the dawn of the coming day when the world will be restored. And so, as I mentioned previously, when we think about Mary as being central to the history of salvation, that is what that setting in this mandola alludes to. That Mary is central not only to Jesus' being born, but also to the world ultimately being restored. Both Christ and Mary appear in these mandolas so that side by side we see both Christ's divine glory revealed, but also the glory of his mother. So we'll skim ahead. And this is the second kind of icon that we'll look at, and this we'll see a couple of different renderings of. And it's the Horigetria, and you'll see this is a design of the icon, and then you see here at least from about the waist up, mid-level up. And this is a Byzantine rendering from the first half of the 14th century. It's actually, as you may recall, traced back to St. Luke. These are later renderings, but this occurred in the early centuries of the church. And so Byzantine tradition will trace it back to St. Luke, and say that, so Luke painted this icon of the Virgin Mary and of Christ while they were living, and that he then sent this portrait along with a copy of his gospel to the most excellent Theophilus, who's referred to in Luke 1:3. So when he writes, and that's in the text, that this gospel is going to Theophilus, the Byzantine understanding was that this portrait went with that text. The name Hodegetria first appears on seals in the 9th century. And so there's some uncertainty about where the name actually derives from. One thought is that it's derived from the church of the commanders, which would have been Hodegon. Or otherwise, that it refers to Mary as a guide in her own right. So either a church named the Church of the Commanders, where emperors would have prayed before they left the capital at the head of an army, or else a name that denotes a quality of Mary herself. But by the 9th century, when this name first starts to appear, this icon in particular had already been ascribed a particular kind of role in the destinies of the Christian empire, precisely for things you can imagine, right? If emperors are praying with this icon before they go out into battle, you might understand why they would attach a certain significance to what the outcome of the battle or the skirmish was going to be. And so that solidified the Hodegetria as a particularly prominent type of this icon. So the Syrian prototype, which this is not, this is Byzantine, but before this, the Syrian prototype had Jesus in swaddling clothes. It was Mary and Jesus nursing, and Jesus would be half lying in Mary's left arm. And so the Byzantine rendering that's later on, which comes to be most prominent, as you can see, does not have Jesus in swaddling clothes or nursing. It has him sitting erect, held in Mary's left arm. He has a scroll in his own left hand, and he has that sign of blessing that he's giving with his right. And as we look at Mary's hands, with her left she's holding Jesus, but with her right she has it centered slightly, and we could think of this perhaps as a hand that's gesturing prayer. But in fact, in this context, it's a gesture of presentation. And what's so fascinating is that it's a twofold presentation. It is Mary presenting Jesus, the Son of God, to all of creation, but it is also Mary presenting the faithful to Jesus, who gives them his blessing.
What's the significance of the robes that Jesus is wearing? Are those little imperial robes?
It is called a hamartion. And he's always wearing it. In other ones, he's wearing the golden one. And then Mary's wearing a mephorion, which later you'll see gets those stars. And if we consider this to be sort of a standard, this is the basis off of which then you can see the significance in the deviations, for want of a better word, in different icons, because later you'll see there's an icon in which this garment has fallen down on Jesus, and there's a white tunic that's exposed at the top that's embroidered. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's the general idea. So
is it a priestly robe, or is it a...
I do not know. It's not identified exclusively as such. But what's made most of is the posture that he has. Because as you can see, he's also facing fully ahead. He's not looking at Mary at all. He's not lying down, he's sitting right up. The blessing is authoritative, there's a solemnity to it. And so that's the aspect of this icon that's made the most of. And I hadn't seen any mention of exclusively priestly identification with what he was wearing, but that could very well be. So if we look,
Points to you for knowing the name, I gotta just say. That was amazing.
Exactly. Points to you for asking excellent questions. So this is the Smolensk rendering of that same polygatria. The original icon, of which this is a reproduction, it's a reproduction from the 16th century. The original icon is said to have been placed in the Cathedral of Smolensk in 1101. And again, we note the solemnity on the expressions of Mary and of Jesus, but there also seems to be a few changes. And this is where we can do a little bit of iconographical spot the difference. So what differences do you spot, if anything? It's hard to remember what comes before.
Mary's hand.
Say it one more time.
Mary's hand.
Mary's hand.
It's a little different.
It's a little different. It is. What were you going to say, Mom?
In the last image, Jesus was more authoritative, as you said. In this, she is, sort of holding him up, like her hand above, under his is more of a, not a guidance, but you know what I mean, that difference of.
No, exactly, because here Jesus is sort of pivoted a bit. So now he's on this angle. And the gesture of the blessing as well. It's less this, and it's a little more relaxed. And we note on the Mephorion, the garment that Mary's wearing, we've got these stars that you can see, presumably another one there, that, as you may recall, are to denote Mary's perpetual virginity. And it's worth clarifying, perpetual virginity would be understood as before, during, and after confinement. And the stars are actually a decorative development of crosses that first appeared in earlier icons of this kind, and they habitually decorated Mary's Mephorion in whatever context she appeared. So those evolved from crosses to stars. And we have the archangels Michael and Gabriel, who are up in the corners there. So where we had the seraph before, the red seraph beneath Mary, we've got Mary flanked here by the two archangels.
What is in Jesus' left hand?
That is the scroll. That's the same. So he's holding, and so I mean, you can. What ideas might you have of what that scroll might? It could signify all kinds of things in this context. But if you think of the child Jesus holding the scroll, what comes to mind?
Temple.
The temple. Yeah, when he's a little boy.
Yep.
And he's going to sit and he says,
Broke the lamp.
"Didn't you know I'd be here? Why would you waste 4 days looking for me?" Could also be, if it's an attribute of God, a scroll might signify what?
Word is knowledge.
Words, knowledge, wisdom, exactly. Authority, yep. So there's something powerful, though, about Jesus being depicted as an infant, but who at the same time holds authority, has knowledge, has wisdom, is the word he holds and the word he embodies. So we'll look at one more. This is another one, again from the first half of the 16th century, the Tikvina, Mother of God, which most closely resembles the Holygatria Eleusa, which is the merciful Holygatria, partly because of the expressions on the faces, especially on the face of Mary. In previous iterations, as we saw Mary's face, is looking at the spectator squarely. Exactly. Now you see the tilt exactly towards Jesus, and also something slightly different around her eyes particularly. Jesus again, also you see, as you were saying, the turn of Jesus going more towards his mother. And what is really sort of fabulous about this, whereas in the previous icons that we've seen so far of the Holy Three, Jesus has been sitting erect in Mary's arm with his feet, for the most part, hanging down. Here, he's sitting slightly differently, so that you'll see the right sole of his foot is exposed. Again, what seems to be so significant for the iconographers is the posture in which Jesus sits and Mary stands and holds, and those little subtleties that can communicate so much about who they are and who their relationship is, especially in this sort of context where they're not looking at each other, and yet there's so much being said between them to each other. And where that gesture of benediction had been very authoritative initially, and then we've seen it be ever so slightly less so, here it's almost, because of Jesus' hand being right where that highlighting color of the Mephorion is, it almost brings you more into the relationship and has you almost thinking that Jesus' hand is not reaching out to bless the spectator, but almost touching the robe of his mother. So it's less ceremonious. And while Mary's head is more inclined towards her son, she's still got that expression of solemnity. That hasn't changed a huge amount yet. But if there's an expression on Mary's face besides solemnity in this icon, how might you name it? What might we say her face expresses? Or what does it bring to mind?
I think she appears to be actually slightly burdened,
Yeah.
like she's her sponsorship and giving forth, she's like been through a lot.
Yep, that she's been through a lot, that she's not only carrying a son, but carrying a whole lot of other weight.
No.
Any other thoughts?
It seems like suffering and vulnerability is running throughout it. I mean, the vulnerability, for some reason, the little foot aiming at the viewer is a sign of incredible vulnerability.
Especially when he's so covered everywhere else.
And Jesus appears to be older.
Yeah.
It's like a little old man with a receding hairline. It's very funny. Did he have it cut that way? Did it grow?
No one had the courage to ask,
But
right?
he was very communicative at the same time. The mind boggles. But no.
Don't mention
But there's a sense of the furrowed eyebrows on the part of Mary. And does she know what's going to happen to her son? Does she know while she's holding this baby exactly how his earthly life is going to end, at least for 3 days? And is that any part of what she has to carry throughout those intervening years and throughout her life? There's a sense that, with all these icons really, that while it's this very personal relationship happening between the two of them, that it's bringing in. Oh, what were you going to say, John?
I have a question.
Yes.
What are those symbols in the upper right and left-hand corners?
Those would denote what the icons are, so it's like different Cyrillic lettering initials. And if my Cyrillic or my eyes were better, possibly say, or is it Greek? I think it is Greek, actually.
What year is that from?
This reproduction is from the first half of the 16th century.
Yeah, so it's likely Cyrillic, but they always did a lot of, I actually took Russian and I could not read most icons. Even, because I can read like the Cyrillic you find on a page, but I cannot read, because they always would stylize it, so if you're straining, it's a good thing. It's normal.
The outline around Mary's face,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, more squared off than the
Yeah, with the
straight line.
Yeah. No, exactly. So it's interesting, like that you would think, that one icon would sort of be the same. It would have the same. Why would people reproduce thousands of icons of the same type? Wouldn't they find the one that was really good and then just keep repeating it? And yet there are all these subtle shifts in the expression. No, and whether that.
It must be the artist's way of doing it.
Well, and even if and also because it's highlighted, right? It's not it's not the same dark color, and so even whether that adds to a certain amount of severity in the expression that we see in Mary's face, that it's not all soft and rounded.
But on the other one, it was.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. We can go back. No, so it's much more draped, much more sort of natural folds, as opposed to a much more stylized. It's like they use starch, but they probably didn't.
Right.
So if we look here, this is the same. So again, the same Tigrinya, Mother of God, again from around the 16th century. We show this just to give even more sense of the variation that happens. Again, we've got presumably the same initials. And so many things about this are similar, including, as you were saying, John, right, the fold chart, and yet there's a different cast to this rendering. And the previous one, and as Joyce was mentioned, Jesus looks a lot younger. Yeah. The skull is darker. You can still see the exposed sole of his foot very slightly. But even as you saw before, right, the placement of that hand right over the sort of gilded edge of Mary's robe softens it, and his body still so turned towards her, and their faces in this sort of parallel.
The symbols on Mary's robe, is that,
These are still, so this would be decorative, but these are the stars.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, those would be, and you can almost see the sense of a cross in this one particularly. But yeah, so still that faithful acknowledgement of the Mother of God's perpetual virginity rather than divinity. So again, on the one hand, the same type of the Harigatria, but at the same time there being a difference in the faithful rendering of that icon. Here, this is the Kazan, Mother of God, and again, these are all bar, the first icon, which was the icon of the sign where it's Mary in the praying position with Jesus there. All the other icons we've seen so far, they're all of the Harigatria. They're all the same composition of Mary holding Jesus, and yet what a wealth of difference and a wealth to ponder in seeing same images. And so I give you these because this is, you can compare at least. This is that most recent image that we saw.
But
But then-
just for clarification, so
Yeah.
that one on the right is the Kazan?
These are the last two. So this is the, yep, this is the Kazan and this is the Tiffany.
Gosh, they're so similar.
Well, actually, no, I beg your pardon. These are, no. What I did, sorry, now I remember. What I did is I put the two,
Tikvene.
yep, so that you can see. It's a little easier, because I thought when I put it together, I thought it would be easier to see what are apparently both of the same icon, but what still have different ways, as you were saying, John, different stars.
Well, you know, Mary's face is much clearer, but Mary and Jesus' face is much clearer.
Yeah, the way that the lighting
Yeah.
is used. So yes, even then. So many different shades of what's going on, even when it comes under the same type of the same heliotria.
Mary's nose seems to be exaggerated in length.
Yes, I believe that is a pretty
And
consistent.
I'm wondering if that, you know, between that and the eyebrows, whether it's a cross.
I do not know whether it's a cross, but it is, you know, the lines though, and what it evokes. I mean, it's definitely all of it together is unifying something to us. And so, okay, here it is. This is the Kazan, Mother of God. So, and what you see is, it's the same, if we went back to that design, that outline, it's the same design, but it's only of the top. So each of these that we see, something happens not just by how the postures are changed, or by how much we can see, you know, of Jesus' foot, or the angle that Jesus is placed at, but also how much is actually included in the icon, how much is in view. Because here is almost a close-up, and it's sort of a combination of the two, right? Because now we see Jesus, you can't see any of Mary's arms, you can't see her hands at all, but you see that Jesus is erect, and we've returned to Jesus facing straight ahead. And yet we have Mary's head tilting even further toward Jesus. The icon was damaged by a burn, but so this is where that gesture of blessing
Yeah.
would still be happening. But even then, just based at the angle of Jesus' arm, it's still not that same facing forward benediction, the authoritative one that we saw in the first Byzantine rendering. So this is actually possibly the most widespread icon of the Mother of God in Russia, is this one. It reduces Mary to the shoulders. And so, as we've mentioned, right, the right hand held in prayer and the left one holding Jesus aren't visible to us. And Jesus only appears to the waist, so his feet, his legs aren't in view at all. And Mary's head inclines ever more than in the previous two icons we looked at, towards Jesus. They're touching. The heads are touching.
The eyes are exaggerated.
They are. So how would you think of this expression on Mary's face compared to the previous ones? I mean, her face in and of itself looks very different. The eyes are huge.
The whole head is huge. It's like out of proportion
The head,
to Jesus.
what Troy was saying, that
Mary's the central figure here, no question.
Yeah.
Jesus is merely incidental.
Right.
He's there, but Mary's the one you're drawn to.
his face almost, is the difference in complexion. It's almost like Jesus is a doll.
Yeah.
I mean, that, am I wrong? I mean, I feel embarrassed to say that because I don't want to run it down.
No, but the proportions though, he's tiny.
He's tiny. Little statue.
And there's a tenderness
Yeah.
that starts to come in Mary's face. even though she isn't looking at Jesus directly.
But
And
I
so-
see that, excuse me, I'm
Yes,
sorry.
of course, Kate.
But I see that as the significance of her, her role as a mother
Yes.
and his original teacher.
Yeah.
And that when I was saying about her hand not touching his, that, she is the mother, his original teacher, and yet she gives him space. And she knows that this is a person that he belongs to the world. She'll be letting go, but yet she's the mother, and I see in her eyes as being very protective.
Yeah.
And in the last image as well,
Yeah.
I saw her as being, intensely protective of him.
No, it's fascinating.
That's a beautiful interpretation, Kate, because I think obviously the icon exists as kind of school of virtue for us. So we're supposed to look and see who are we to be like, who are we to emulate? And there's a sense in which being like Jesus, well, that's really difficult. Most of us have experienced that, but we can kind of see in Mary something like what we can be like. And Mary is like Jesus in the respect of all the ways she bore Jesus. She was the bearer of Christ. She's the perfect saint. So that's a beautiful vision.
And this is where we've come from. We've come from this very ceremonial, square-on, authoritative presentation where Mary presents Jesus to the world and Mary presents the faithful to Jesus for Christ's own blessing. And within the same type of icon, we have everything you were saying, okay? All of that protectiveness, that total investment. And that's really what these open up for us, especially the Kazan. This notion of exactly what the humanity really looks like, that the humanity of the Mother of God is the same humanity with which Jesus is imbued. And how we think about it, and how we think of our own humanity. And the burdens that we are carrying, the weight that Mary carries, all of that, how that speaks to us of who we are and what God asks of us. So, this is the third and final type that we're going to look at briefly. It's the icon of loving kindness. And you could say that even more here is that human aspect of divine motherhood and of the incarnation present. Their faces touch. They are pressed into each other. It is the image of the Mother of God who is grieving the passion of her Son, that she knows he's going to suffer, and she endures the inevitability of it in silence, as revealed to her in advance in Luke 2:35, and a sword will pierce your own heart also. And here, how very different from the previous figure of Christ that we just saw, right, where he's pretty much on the side, he's a doll. Here, Christ full of tenderness, of feeling, almost of fear. And as you can see, the most distinctive aspect, once more, is the posture. It's the way that Mary holds Jesus so differently and yet similarly. That hand is still a hand of prayer, of presentation perhaps, but the other one is doing something very, very different. Christ's left hand around his mother's neck. And there's a solemn calm to Mary, but at the same time, there's Jesus in this very lively and tender movement. And he presses his cheek to hers. And we might meditate for a good while on what on earth that touch signifies, what movement Jesus is making towards his own mother. This is another, that was the Vladimir Mother of God, this is the Korsun Mother of God. And the head, we've seen this angling, this tilting of Mary's head towards Jesus, now it is bent strongly to the left, and it's a hemation. So this is the same robe that Jesus has been wearing in all of the other icons that slip down to reveal this tunic. And again, what you might think about vulnerability of God's self. In that moment here, the feet are hanging down. You can see that again. And there's this clinging almost to Mary's robes. Both of the hands are in front, whereas the other one, there was the arm that was around the back of her neck. And there's a certain dramatic quality to it where Jesus impulsively stretches towards his mother's face as she gazes out onto the spectator. Compared with, as I say, that original, that Byzantine icon, solemn, ceremonial, facing forward, this is full of warmth and intimacy. And so, as Mary, what strikes me so much is that this dual embrace of Jesus and also this gaze on the spectator that signifies for us that Mary's relationship with her son and all the humanity and all the divinity that that entails means that as she embraces Jesus, she embraces the world. And her gaze draws us into participation with her prayer and her life. And finally, you see one more. This is the last one. And it's again the same Korsun Mother of God. And as you see, right, there's barely anything of the bodies. It's just the faces and the arms. And epitomizes the intimacy of this icon of loving kindness. They are tightly pressed into one another. And Mary is hugging Jesus to her with both hands. And what's so funny is this is the scroll. The scroll is still there in the midst of this tight embrace, which seems almost at first glance to be an extraneous object that's muscled its way in to an intimate moment. And yet, the scroll emphasizes the advent of the wisdom of God. Wisdom that comes out of this physical contact with which suffering and sorrow are illumined, and so turn to joy. And there's this sense of helplessness and omnipotence that are combined, as they are in a God who is fully divine and fully human. Comments or questions? And then we have to church. Yep, go for it.
Well, I think too, she becomes so much more feminine too.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful statue at the DIA, where she's a little more than the throne.
Mm-hmm.
And he's wagging his finger more than blessing. And then you go to the next room and she's a Florentine pretty girl. So I think it's so interesting is that the acknowledgement of her femininity in infancy development.
No, exactly. It is, yeah, and what that opens up for what femininity.
At the same time, it seems as there's a kind of progression here that Jesus is also changing and becoming more childlike in those later images. And it's curious, I mean, you mentioned that she's trying to embrace all of us in this process. But I didn't get that impression. It seems to me, it's kind of ironic, I guess, but as the intimacy between Jesus and Mary grows toward those later images, I find there's a less welcoming aspect to this. It's almost as though they're retreating into each other, and I'm kind of feeling left out of this.
You're eavesdropping on something.
Well, yeah, you know, it's a very intimate moment, but I don't necessarily feel like there's a beckoning quality to Jesus's involvement or Mary's involvement with me, right? Whereas there was a kind of formality, almost an off-putting formality in the earlier images, but yet it's still very clear that I'm being addressed.
You're supposed to be there.
Yes, and it is a little awe-inspiring, but that's a different kind of feeling than what you get here, where it's Jesus and Mary, you know, and it is a human moment, no question, but I don't see the imperial God as much saying, okay, now, you know, Jesus with authority, Jesus with power, right? This is a very different, vulnerable kind of image, which is weird. I don't know.
It seems to just symbolize the unconditional, pure, unconditional love.
Yeah, they can take so many different forms and yet be not dependent on the proximity, the degree of emotion even, that it can be present with high degrees of emotion, it can be present in highly ceremonial situations, and that love and that divine, that full divinity, full humanity is no less present in any of those, even as different postures speak to us in different ways and open up to us who God is. We should probably wrap up so that I can get vested, and some of you need to go to church.